Wanted. Ambitious individual for leadership position. Be prepared for difficult application process and stressful work environment. Challenges, many. Rewards, numerous. Failure, possible. Your employer, the American people. The few chosen have been the presidents. On January 20th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated for an unprecedented fourth presidential term. For the past 12 years, he had successfully guided the nation through the Great Depression and was in the midst of leading it toward victory in World War II. For many Americans, he was the only president they had ever known. But unbeknownst to the public, he was in failing health. On April 12, 1945, FDR's third vice president in 4 terms, Harry S. Truman, received an urgent call. Only 3 months into his new job, Truman was asked to come quickly, but quietly, to the White House. Waiting for him was not FDR, but the First Lady. "Harry," she said, "the president is dead." Stunned, Truman responded, "Is there anything we can do for you?" "No," Eleanor replied. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." Number 33, Harry S. Truman, Democrat, 1945 to 1953, 60 years old, from Missouri. If Truman was astonished to learn that he had suddenly become President of the United States, the world was stunned.
It was quite a shock. Americans, the world, sort of held their breath to see what Truman would do.
He was really not that much of a national or worldly figure, so people were appalled. Everybody said, "Who is this man Truman? Woe is the nation, because we've got this ignoramus from Missouri who doesn't know anything about the world," and on and on and on. Well, he fooled them.
Truman had led an average, undistinguished life until getting involved in politics at age 50. Before then, he'd been a farmer and a businessman.
Harry Truman was a failed haberdasher from Kansas City, Missouri in some ways, but he was plain-spoken, he was blunt, he was a good leader, and he had common sense. And it shows that it's not depth of knowledge, but that good basic common sense that's so important to the American presidency.
Truman was not one to mince words.
He's called peppery. Some might say dyspeptic, some might say occasionally profane, certainly plain-spoken. He called a spade, and sometimes worse than a spade.
Well, during my lifetime, Harry Truman was my favorite. I admired him very much. I admired his honesty, his down-to-earth kind of approach to government, his willingness to make politically controversial decisions if he thought they were right, no matter how much it cost him in popular support.
One such decision confronted him almost immediately. After taking the oath, Truman was told for the first time about the Manhattan Project. This new president now faced the most consequential decision a president or any leader has ever had to make: the choice of dropping the first atomic bomb. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in the European theater was over. Yet the U.S. was still preparing for what looked to be a costly invasion of Japan.
The estimates were any place from 1 million to 500,000 casualties if you invaded Japan, and you had this weapon. And I think this was a clear-cut decision, and old Harry Truman's Missouri common sense just came through.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
On August 15, 1945, the Japanese surrendered. World War II was over. Truman's initial decisiveness would come to define his presidency.
He believed that it was important, both for his own political credibility and also for the position of the United States at this critical moment at the end of the war, to make decisions and stick with it. He did adopt the motto that the buck stopped here, meaning the desk of the president, and that was something that a lot of people came to admire.
Although the war had ended, a new struggle was beginning. The United States versus the USSR, capitalism versus communism.
He gathers what we call the wise men, these great titans of foreign policy, to come help him figure out how to deal with the Soviet Union.
It was Harry Truman, George Marshall, and Dean Acheson who devised communist containment, the idea of containing the spread of communism, not trying to eliminate it militarily, waging a war of ideas in the confident belief that over time capitalism would prevail in Western democracy.
The policy of containment came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. It asserted America's right to support any nation in its struggle to fend off communist aggression. To rebuild war-ravaged Western Europe, thought to be vulnerable to the communist threat, Truman put forward the Marshall Plan.
The United States government spent upwards of $12 to $14 billion in the reconstruction of Europe. And nearly everybody, historians, political scientists, contemporaries, judged the Marshall Plan a resounding success.
By advancing the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and NATO, Truman hoped America would serve as a role model of democracy for the world. Yet while promoting equality and fighting poverty abroad, Truman faced inequality at home.
He understood the hypocrisy between having just fought a war, ostensibly, against racism, and yet racism embedded in every aspect of American life.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
In January 1948, Truman boldly ended segregation in the armed forces and the civil service by executive order.
The modern civil rights revolution, as far as the presidency is concerned, really begins with Harry Truman.
Truman's civil rights initiative was courageous, yet controversial. Furthermore, it appeared to be an act of political suicide. 1948 was an election year. Compounding Truman's troubles was an inflationary economy and an unprecedented number of labor strikes.
Truman's popularity at the beginning of 1948 was about as low as any sitting chief executive had been, certainly any executive who had any hopes or any desire to be reelected. So Truman was written off.
Truman, however, campaigned fiercely. He crisscrossed the nation in a landmark whistle-stop tour, traveling 30,000 miles and giving 271 speeches. By contrast, his Republican challenger, Thomas Dewey, seemed to expect the presidency rather than campaign for it. He gave only 16 speeches. In a genuine surprise, Truman carried the popular and electoral vote, but the elation of his upset victory would soon be replaced by unyielding misery in his second term. First was the loss of America's former wartime ally, China, to communism.
He was caught. He had been talking about the need to contain communism. Containment had failed in China, and it was inevitable that he was going to have to accept the blame.
The Chinese Revolution, followed by the Soviets' entree into atomic weaponry, created hysteria on the American home front. Truman's administration was attacked by Senator Joe McCarthy for being soft on communism.
When, 6 months later, North Korean communists invade South Korea, Truman, from a political standpoint, had almost no alternative but to say that the United States was going to go to the defense of non-communist South Korea.
The Korean War was unlike any other. Despite some early successes, it turned into a stalemate when China threw its numerical might behind North Korea. There were other problems in the region, specifically the escalating crisis for control of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the founder of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the Communist North, asked Truman for assistance in his fight for freedom from French colonialism. France, in turn, asked Truman to support them in their fight against the communists in Hanoi.
It became a priority of his administration to prevent the French from being defeated by communist forces in Southeast Asia. This was the beginning of America's involvement in the Vietnam War.
By the end of his second term, nothing seemed to be going right for Truman. He was tarnished by the ongoing Korean War, the loss of China to communism, and disclosures of corruption in many agencies of the executive branch. Truman's popularity sank to an all-time low.
When Truman left office at the beginning of 1953, he himself probably thought that he couldn't have been elected dog catcher, even in his hometown of Independence.
It would be decades before Truman would be appreciated for his adept conclusion of the Second World War, the highly successful Marshall Plan, and the first bold steps to end racial segregation.
He went out of office with a very low popularity rating. I think it was about 23%. But as people assessed what he had done in office, now he's become one of the most admired presidents of all time.
Harry Truman was so nearsighted that in order to enlist during World War I, he had to cheat by memorizing the Army's eye exam chart. If there was one American who appealed to everyone in 1952, it was General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Oh, Eisenhower was a God figure. I mean, all over the world.
Although he had shown no interest in politics, Ike was pursued as a presidential candidate by both the Republicans and the Democrats.
He didn't seek the office of presidency, the office sought him. He was a very reluctant candidate. Both parties would give him anything to have him in their party.
Dissatisfied with the Democrats, from their handling of the Korean War to the charges of corruption within the White House,
I believe in the future of the United States of America.
Eisenhower decided to join the Republicans and run for office.
I think Eisenhower felt that the country really did need him. And he had been reluctant, but he also was reluctant to let the country go in the wrong direction. And I think as he watched it going in the wrong direction, Eisenhower felt that he was the right man to be able to help the country.
Number 34, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican, 1953 to 1961, 62 years old, from Kansas. Dwight Eisenhower is remembered in two distinct, if contradictory, ways. First, as the legendary mastermind of D-Day, and second, as a seemingly semi-retired president who'd rather play golf than govern.
He was a much better politician than he went on, like George Washington, his hero. Washington's genius was to convince everyone, beginning with himself, that he was no politician. Eisenhower did much of the same thing. You do not get to be a five-star general of the Army without having keen political instincts.
Beyond Eisenhower's military celebrity was a very charismatic individual. "I like Ike" was more than a campaign slogan. It was a true sentiment.
There was a marvelous aura about him. You could just feel it. He was confident. He was a decent man. He wanted to do what was right for the country.
While Americans liked and trusted Ike, they weren't always sure he was completely engaged in Oval Office affairs.
Most people thought that Eisenhower was essentially presiding over an administration that others were making the decisions. And it became known as the hidden hand presidency, that he had a public perception of being out to lunch, but behind the scenes, every decision of note, every major policy decision really was Eisenhower's decision, and he was calling the shots.
In his first significant accomplishment, Eisenhower brought about an end to the Korean War, forging an armistice that is still in effect today. Eisenhower's military career had been focused on waging war. Now it appeared that Eisenhower was determined to use his presidency to pursue peace. He began by downsizing the military. By spending less money on defense, Ike believed that America could spend more on infrastructure and quality of life. Indeed, he went from orchestrating the largest military operation in history to pushing the world's largest public works project through Congress, the Federal Highway Act.
He probably created the greatest change in our culture in almost the history of the nation, and that was with the Federal Highway Act. He changed the entire face of America.
While Americans welcomed the change on their landscape, they were not receptive to other changes in their culture. One of the great unresolved issues after World War II was whether or not African Americans would be forced to continue to live in a segregated society. In 1954, the Supreme Court banned racial segregation in public schools with its landmark ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. Although Eisenhower had appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, the motivating force behind the revolutionary ruling, Eisenhower publicly distanced himself from the decision.
He thought that it was disruptive, he thought it was an inappropriate role for the federal government, and he really thought that it wasn't yet time for desegregation, or that the country wasn't really ready for it, the South wasn't really ready for it.
Eisenhower was paying more attention to foreign affairs. In 1954, after the French were defeated in Vietnam and the country was split in two, Ike pledged his support for the pro-Western government of South Vietnam over the communist-run North.
Eisenhower took a series of steps that were absolutely essential to us becoming more and more involved in Vietnam. The most important was his support of the creation of the Bank of Vietnam, the sending of huge sums of money to Vietnam in terms of aid and support.
Under Ike's leadership, America enjoyed peace and great prosperity during his first term. With the economy soaring, Ike easily won re-election in 1956. Traditionally, second presidential terms are much tougher than the first, and this was true for Eisenhower. First, he had health concerns. Ike had a heart attack in 1955. That, combined with his aloof reaction to growing civil rights unrest, made him seem weak. Then came Sputnik, the first satellite in space launched by the Soviets in 1957. Americans became hysterical, believing that there was a missile gap in the Russians' favor.
They had beaten us into space. I think the United States changed, at least Washington did, more on that night than many people realized, because we went back to work and said, okay, this is a race, and we can't let it happen.
Then, in 1959, Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba and established a revolutionary regime just 90 miles from Florida. Another sign that America was losing out to the Soviets.
At the end of the Eisenhower presidency, there was a kind of malaise in the United States, a feeling that communism was overwhelming us.
The grandfatherly image Eisenhower had enjoyed was now something of a liability. In his final address to the nation, Eisenhower spoke to the American people with unprecedented candor.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
For a military man, a general who had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces, this was a stunning pronouncement. The hero of World War II wanted nothing more than to leave behind a presidential legacy of peace.
He recognized that war has to be a last resort. I think only someone who's fought and seen the destructiveness of war can feel it in their gut the way a man like Eisenhower did.
In honor of his grandson, Eisenhower changed the name of the presidential retreat in Maryland from Shangri-La to Camp David in 1953. John F. Kennedy was the youngest man ever elected president. At his inauguration, Kennedy told the world that he represented America's youth.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Kennedy's new generation was the youth of America. In them, Kennedy inspired hope and the promise of a better tomorrow.
I've been through 10 presidents, almost 50 years of watching that White House, and that was special. There was a feeling in that administration by these young people who came to Washington that this was a wonderful time, and it was.
Number 35, John F. Kennedy, Democrat, 1961 to 1963, 43 years old, from Massachusetts. John Kennedy would be in office for less than 3 years, a fabled 1,000 days. But in that short span of time, he changed history.
He changed the American political system. He changed America culturally as well. He became the great role model about how American men should look, dress, act.
Kennedy had lived a charmed existence, and it showed. He and his wife Jacqueline looked like movie stars. In terms of the Cold War, the Kennedys were the best advertising there was for capitalism.
John F. Kennedy was magic. I mean, he lit up a room. People were attracted to him, fell in love with him his entire life, both men and women.
Kennedy's sexual dalliances would eventually become well known. But while president, he successfully compartmentalized his private life, including the fact that he suffered from many debilitating illnesses, such as Addison's disease. Kennedy's hidden health problems and sexual appetite never seemed to interfere with his ability to effectively lead. And he did this with an open-door policy.
Kennedy was his own chief of staff. He often described himself as the hub in the middle of a wheel. He wanted people coming directly to him and tell him the bad news.
Among those who came to JFK early in his administration was the director for plans of the CIA. He wanted the U.S. to secretly launch a scheme known as the Bay of Pigs. The plan called for a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro's communist regime. Kennedy okayed the operation. It was a disaster. Even more surprising was Kennedy's response.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
He thought the only way out was to take complete responsibility. I'm the commander-in-chief. I said this.
Following the Bay of Pigs, we have a documented record of a president with a learning curve, a president who had changed his entire method of operating based upon the fact that he bore sole responsibility for the failure at the Bay of Pigs.
By accepting responsibility, Kennedy earned the trust of the nation. With that, he embarked upon a noble and far-reaching agenda to forge a better society.
Members of the Congress.
He created the Peace Corps and planned a war on poverty. And most inspiring, he challenged America to reach for the unimaginable.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This was a huge idea and an enormous gamble. Such audacity would serve Kennedy well during his defining moment in office, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
On October 16th, 1962, President Kennedy called me in the morning and said that he had received a briefing from the CIA which showed through aerial photographs that the Soviet Union had just placed, or was in the process of placing, in Cuba bases for medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles that were capable of delivering a nuclear payload almost anywhere in the United States.
A week later, Kennedy spoke to the nation.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
I've never heard a more chilling speech. I thought, wow, he's saying we may go into thermonuclear war. And in fact, I think we were that close.
A cold warrior at heart, but not a hawk, Kennedy refused the advice of military commanders who pressed him to launch an airstrike on Cuba. Instead, Kennedy kept a cool head and chose a conciliatory course of action in his negotiation with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Together, they forged a peaceful conclusion to the crisis. While strong on foreign policy, Kennedy was much less proactive on domestic issues, particularly civil rights. At least until 1963, when he personally watched television reports of the violence in Birmingham, Alabama. There, Martin Luther King Jr. was leading a massive protest against segregation.
And the scenes of fire hoses tearing the skin off of young children's backs who were marching peacefully and dogs attacking protesters really changed the public mood in the North and changed the public mood nationally. And it changed the mood within the Kennedy administration.
While Kennedy gained a new appreciation for civil rights, he remained an ardent foe of communism. Late in his first term, as trouble brewed in Southeast Asia, he hoped to strengthen South Vietnam by overthrowing its tyrannical regime. On November 1st, 1963, Kennedy approved the assassination of the President of South Vietnam.
And from that day on, we owned Vietnam.
20 days later, on November 21st, Kennedy visited San Antonio, Texas, to join Vice President Lyndon Johnson at the opening of a new space facility.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
The next day, he and Jackie went to Dallas.
From Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The assassination of Kennedy was probably the most traumatic thing that occurred to our population since at least Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of hope resting in his presidency that he had not yet realized that suddenly people were denied.
The hopes and dreams Kennedy brought with him to the White House were enhanced by his martyrdom, making his presidential legacy grow well beyond his actual accomplishments in office.
The idealism, the commitment to public service, the desire that people should give something of themselves back to America, I think these are some of the most important legacies of the Kennedy administration.
Only 2 men have been elected president while holding seats in the U.S. Senate: Warren G. Harding and John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, left the nation in a state of shock and despair. Within hours of the tragedy, Kennedy's vice president was sworn into office aboard Air Force One. Number 36, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Democrat, 1963 to 1969, age 55, from Texas.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down.
The day after the assassination, Johnson pledged to dedicate his presidency to the fulfillment of Kennedy's legacy. How well Johnson actually enacted Kennedy's presidential agenda was another matter. Johnson was not happy about the way he gained the presidency, but once he had it, there was much he wanted to do.
He was just insatiable about being a great politician. He wanted to be the greatest president in the country's history.
Johnson had risen from poverty to become a hugely powerful politician. He was a larger-than-life character, alternately charismatic and crass.
Oh, Lyndon Johnson, he was one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. He was cunning. It was kind of like being an animal in the jungle. He didn't read, he wasn't a scholar, but he just was so clever and so aware of people and what they did and so able to analyze them. And then he had this kind of volcanic personality, up and down. He was on certain days a little nuts.
He had a ego problem as big as his own hat. He felt inferior dealing with all these Ivy League people, and he occasionally overreacted to that and pushed these people around just to prove he could do it.
Johnson had an in-your-face management style. At 6'2", he overwhelmed people to get what he wanted. It became known as the Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment was getting in people's faces and bullying them, shouting them, bribing them, whatever, to get his own way.
And you didn't know whether it was a gesture of friendship or a gesture of trying to dominate. I think in Johnson it was both.
Besides the treatment, Johnson gained the upper hand by holding meetings in unconventional places. He was skinny dipping in the White House pool when he called for two of his aides to come and listen to his Great Society proposal. This was Johnson's vision of America, realizing its true promise, a democracy with freedom and justice for all.
And he believed wholeheartedly in this vision. It was to raise the underprivileged and the discriminated against to new levels of equality if he could.
Johnson's Great Society resulted in an explosion of new laws. The Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, federal aid for education, environmental protection laws, food stamps, Head Start, National Public Radio, the Public Broadcasting System, consumer protection laws, and the Civil Rights Act.
No president wanted to do more for African Americans than Lyndon Johnson. Civil rights was absolutely at the core of his commitment to a better America, to a great society.
Lyndon Johnson's going to go down in history for one reason, and that's for civil rights.
Johnson also expanded on Kennedy's efforts to fight a war on poverty, and he succeeded, eventually cutting the percentage of those who lived in poverty by half. Winning the war in Vietnam, however, was another matter. In June 1965, General William Westmoreland warned Johnson that he risked losing the war unless he mobilized the reserves, committed more firepower, and doubled the troops from 65,000 to 125,000. Johnson authorized sending 100,000 more troops, but even then, America came no closer to winning the war.
How could it be, he kept asking, that these Vietnamese guerrillas, these guys running around the jungles in black pajamas, could stand up to American military power, to our superior firepower, our technology? This he couldn't fathom, couldn't quite square that with the reality.
At home, the anti-war movement gained momentum. What had started as Truman's containment policy was now Johnson's war.
I spoke to Mrs. Johnson about this, and she said he heard those protesters marching up and down in front of the White House, shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And it was a wound in his heart. He suffered terribly, she said, over the fact that so many boys were dying.
The enemy of freedom has chosen to make this year the decisive one.
The last year of Johnson's presidency began with the devastating Tet Offensive. The bold North Vietnamese advance on Saigon made victory look remote, perhaps impossible. At home, Johnson faced opposition within his own party, from Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. Under fire, Johnson decided not to run for re-election.
Fellow Americans, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson, I think, is the most tragic of all of our American presidents, because no man fell from a higher pinnacle, and no man sought more not to be a war president.
At the end of his term, Johnson tried to negotiate peace with Vietnam, but failed.
I think Johnson's reputation will make a comeback. I think he will be seen as, if not a near great president, but pretty darn close to it. Because in the domestic realm, there is no president other than Franklin Roosevelt who achieved more than LBJ. I think in time, as this Vietnam issue fades somewhat, he'll be seen, I think, as a more effective president than he's been seen in recent years.
Johnson liked the soft drink Fresca so much that he had a soda fountain installed in the Oval Office that dispensed only Fresca. Richard Nixon had spent the better part of his lengthy political career scheming and campaigning for the presidency. In 1968, he ran on a platform that included what he called a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. In truth, Nixon wanted to keep the war going.
The last thing he wanted was for the Democrats to gain a signal diplomatic victory, an October surprise. And so he led on to the South Vietnamese that if they could hold on, that they could hope for something better from Richard Nixon.
It was the first of many illicit acts that would ultimately lead to the most shameful presidential downfall in history. Number 37, Richard M. Nixon, Republican, 1969 to 1974, 56 years old, from California. Nixon was one of the most experienced politicians of the 20th century. He'd been a congressman, U.S. senator, and vice president. But by the time he finally became president, he had also accumulated many enemies.
Nixon always kept lists of enemies, and he really saw the presidency in large part as a vehicle for punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends, and for promoting his own image.
He had within him demons, personal demons, that he really could not control. He's a man who bore deep resentments against his enemies and thought his enemies were everywhere.
What's the matter with these clowns?
Nixon's paranoia was rooted in deep insecurity. Ambitious to a fault, he harbored a desperate need to prove himself and rise above his middle-class origins. Nixon's personality reflected his management style. He was obsessed with power and had to be in control at all times. Nixon bypassed the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense so that he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, could control foreign policy.
Nixon wanted to run foreign policy out of the White House, and partly he wanted to do so because he was smarter about foreign policy, but partly because he wanted to do it in a secretive fashion.
Publicly, Nixon endorsed a plan to end America's involvement in Vietnam. Privately, Nixon escalated the war effort by bombing Cambodia and sending the Marines to invade Laos. In May 1969, when the New York Times revealed the secret bombings, Nixon went ballistic. He ordered wide-scale wiretapping of government officials and journalists to try and trace the leak.
This was really the beginning of the in-house wiretapping in the Nixon administration, arguably the beginning of Watergate as we understand that term, sort of all of the secret illegal doings that Nixon and Kissinger and others participated in.
While Nixon and Kissinger had surreptitiously intensified the conflict in Vietnam, they also pursued a radical new plan to end it.
The architecture that Nixon and Kissinger come up with is what's called a triangular diplomacy, in which we disengage from Vietnam while playing Russia and China off against each other.
Nixon understood that the key to peace in Vietnam was a good relationship with China, Vietnam's ally. Toward this, he forged a diplomatic relationship with the Chinese, then brokered an agreement with Hanoi in January 1973.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
He saw that was really the only way he could ultimately pull out of Vietnam. He also saw this as an opportunity to exert leverage on the Soviet Union. And he very effectively sort of played both sides of the fence. Even as he was making the overtures to China, he was also talking with Brezhnev about starting to improve relations.
Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, followed by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets in May, were the crowning achievements of his presidency. These diplomatic breakthroughs with the communist world secured Nixon's landslide re-election later that year. It also led to an official ceasefire in Vietnam. In January 1973, North Vietnam and South Vietnam agreed to stop fighting. But secretly, and without the consent of Congress, Nixon promised the president of South Vietnam that the U.S. would restart bombing North Vietnam if Hanoi violated the accord. Simultaneously, in 1973, a political scandal was heating up: Watergate.
Nixon's wiretapping of reporters, the infiltration of the student movement, the infiltration of the Black Panther movement, the possible overthrow of the Chilean government. All these things were hanging around like fireflies on a summer night when the Watergate story hit.
Nixon fought the inevitable for 2 torturous years, believing that he, as president, was somehow above the law.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
In July 1974, after 14 months of congressional hearings on Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee passed an article of impeachment charging Nixon with obstruction of justice. But before the House could vote to impeach, Nixon resigned on August 9th.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
He was angry. He was very angry at his enemies, but he was also angry at himself. As he looked back, he said, I gave my enemies a sword, and they ran me through.
Nixon's legacy is divided, much like the man himself. On the one hand, he was a brilliant strategist. On the other, he will always be tarnished by Watergate. And he is the only president to resign. After escorting the Nixons to their helicopter, Vice President Gerald Ford silently walked back inside the White House and took the oath of office.
So help me God.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Number 38, Gerald Ford, Republican, 1974 to 1977, 61 years old, from Michigan. As Jerry Ford stepped into the White House, he walked into a house of turmoil. Ford faced the still pending criminal indictment of Nixon, an America which felt betrayed by Washington, and a Congress eager to reclaim power they felt had been usurped. If anyone had the ability to heal the nation after Nixon's resignation, it was Jerry Ford. He was open and honest, with a history of consensus building.
Our country sometimes has a magical ability of coming up with the right person for the time. And after Richard Nixon, you really needed a Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford was the most decent man I've known in the presidency. When he heard about the Nixon enemies list, he said, any man who has to keep a list in order to remember his enemies has got too many enemies.
Right away, Ford became frustrated with his inability to preside over the business of the nation.
Are you saying, sir, that the option of a pardon for former President Nixon is still an option?
He was spending upwards of half his time dealing with issues relating to Watergate.
So I make the final decision.
And he said at some point, you know, we got to cut this off. I've got to govern. We've got to deal with inflation. We've got to deal with Vietnam. We've got to deal with the Soviets. We've got big issues out here. So he said, I'm going to cut it off. Boom, I'm going to pardon him.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
He is correct that it would have consumed his presidency, but it was lack of consultation, lack of preparation, the lack of a sense that he had not built enough legitimacy himself to be able to make that determination.
Compounding the fragile political situation, North Vietnam broke the peace accord and launched an offensive into South Vietnam. Ford requested military and economic aid to help the South Vietnamese, but Congress refused.
Zilch. The Congress wouldn't give any more aid. They had had enough.
The Congress, knowing nothing of the private commitments made between Kissinger and Nixon to President II, just pulled the plug on Vietnam and unleashed one of the great terrors of people seeking freedom.
On April 19, 1975, Saigon fell to the communists.
There's certain things that will be seared in our collective memories about presidencies. The helicopter from the Saigon embassy is one of those. We were evacuating, and people thought we would lose our credibility. People thought it would be the end of America's influence in the world.
As much as Ford struggled to prevent that outcome, he didn't have the support of the nation behind him. Only with time has history been able to look back at Ford's presidency and see, without the emotion of Watergate, what he accomplished.
I asked him what he wanted his legacy to be, and he said, what I really want is to leave my country better than I found it. And he did.
In the 1976 election, Americans wanted to get Watergate and Vietnam behind them, and they would turn to a true Washington outsider as the next occupant of the White House.